I only thought it was a normal act when I stopped my truck to help an old stranger fix his broken-down car on the side of the road. But from that moment, it seemed as though an invisible, inexplicable bond formed between us. Then one day, that old man suddenly appeared at my doorstep. Moments later, the police stormed in, handcuffing my parents and taking them away. And what I discovered afterward shattered my entire life. Hello, my name is Brooks Hatlin. I'm 25 years old, living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a small city where people say time moves as slowly as the Arkansas River drifting through. I'm a truck driver for a large transportation company, spending my days roaming the endless roads around the region. My trips often begin before the sun rises, with only the glow of my headlights cutting through the thick morning fog and the rumble of the engine as my companion. This job isn't glamorous, nothing to brag about, but for me it's my whole world. A world where I can feel free, even if only in the cramped cabin of my truck. I live with my parents in a suburban house in Tulsa, a red brick home with a white picket fence faded by time. From the outside, it might look like a peaceful family home where everyone gathers warmly each evening. But the truth is far different. To me, that house feels like an iron cage painted white, beautiful on the outside but suffocating within. Every time I step through the door, the air feels heavy on my shoulders, as if something is lurking in the walls, in my parents' glances, in the half-finished sentences they exchange. I've always had the feeling that this house is hiding a secret, something monumental that I've never been told. But I've never dared to ask, perhaps because I'm afraid of the answer. My father, Alan Hatlin, is a stern man with sharp features and eyes as cold as steel. He used to work in oil extraction on the rigs at the edge of Tulsa, back when the industry was the city's heartbeat. He often spoke of those days with unhidden pride, as if he were once a king of the oil fields. But now, with age stooping his shoulders, he's grown more bitter, especially toward me. In his eyes, I'm just a useless truck driver, a man without ambition, incapable of making something big like he once dreamed. At every dinner, as I sit across from him at the old wooden table, I feel his gaze, not just disappointment, but contempt. "What's the point of driving for someone else your whole life, Brooks?" he'd ask, his voice low but sharp as a blade. I'd just bow my head, clench my teeth, and try to swallow his words along with the stew my mother made. My mother, Sharon Hatlin, is different. She's a skilled woman, always wearing a smile, but that smile never reaches her eyes. She's a master at hiding her emotions, always knowing how to soothe my father's outbursts with gentle words or a subtle pat on the shoulder. But I know that behind her kindness, she always sides with him, right or wrong. Once, when my father berated me for turning down a promotion, a desk job I knew I'd hate, she just sat there, nodding along with his every word, as if I weren't her son but a stranger. "Listen to your father, Brooks," she'd say, her voice soft as a breeze, but I could feel the coldness beneath it. She never defended me, never asked what I wanted or needed. To her, keeping peace in the house mattered more than anything, even my feelings. My relationship with my parents can't be called close. It's more like an unspoken contract. I get to live in their house, eat their food, but in return, I must endure their control and relentless criticism. They want me to be a different version of themselves, ambitious, successful, with a respectable job they can boast about to the neighbors. But I'm not them. I love my job as a driver, the sense of freedom as I glide past golden wheat fields under the sunset. I don't dream of fancy offices or expensive suits, but to them, that's a failure. Every day in that house feels suffocatingly similar. In the mornings, I wake up early, quietly make coffee in the dim kitchen, trying to avoid running into my parents. Then I drive off, sometimes for the whole day, sometimes overnight, just to delay returning to that house. But what unsettles me most isn't my father's scolding or my mother's coldness. It's the vague, persistent feeling that something is wrong in this house. Some nights, as I lie on my creaky bed in my small room, I hear my parents whispering in the living room. They speak so softly as if afraid I might hear, but I catch fragments. "Don't bring that up again," or no one can know. I wonder, what are they hiding? I've tried to dig deeper, but every lead ends in a dead end. There are no family photos from my father's oil rig days, no keepsakes, nothing to hint at a past beyond what I know. My mother once said my grandfather died long before I was born, but she never gave details. My father just shakes his head whenever I ask, as if mentioning my grandfather is taboo. I've started to think that whatever this secret is, it's tied to my grandfather. A man I only know through fleeting, vague remarks, like a ghostly figure. But I have no proof. Nothing but a gut feeling. And that feeling keeps growing, like a dark cloud hovering over me, making me both curious and afraid. One evening I had just finished a long delivery, exhausted to the bone. The clock on the dashboard showed nearly 10 o'clock at night, and all I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and crawl into bed. Route 66, usually bustling, was now eerily quiet, with only the sound of the wind whistling through the truck's window. As I navigated a curve, my headlights swept across an old beat-up car parked alone on the roadside. The thing looked like a heap of scrap metal with peeling paint and a flat tire. I intended to drive past, but then a frail figure emerged in the beam of my lights. An old man standing by the car holding a flashlight, his eyes weary but not defeated. I'm not the type to stop for strangers. Tulsa isn't a dangerous place, but you never know what might happen on desolate roads at night. Yet something about the old man made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way he stood, slightly hunched but exuding a quiet resilience, as if he'd weathered countless storms in his life. I pulled over, turned off the engine, and stepped out. "You okay?" I called, my voice slightly hoarse from the cold. The old man looked up, his eyes gleaming under the brim of a worn-out cap. He was thin, likely in his 70s, with a weathered face etched with deep wrinkles, like a map charting a long, arduous life. But his eyes, they didn't belong to a frail old man. They were bright, profound, as if they could see right through me. "Thank you, young man," he said, his voice low and warm. "My car's broken down. Flat tire, and I don't have the strength to change it." I nodded, grabbed my toolkit from the truck, and got to work. As I loosened bolts and swapped the tire, the old man stood there, silently watching me. Occasionally, he asked a question, his voice gentle but deliberate. "You a driver?" "Tulsa's changed a lot, hasn't it?" I answered briefly, not thinking much of it, but something about his tone felt strange. He called me Brooks. Not kid or buddy like strangers usually do, but Brooks, as if he'd known me for years. I was momentarily surprised, but brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd mentioned my name without realizing it. When I finished, the old man patted my shoulder, his bony hand surprisingly firm. "Thank you. You're a good person." He smiled, a smile so warm it felt like a fire in the winter night. He said his name was Lester, then extended his hand for a shake. I took it, feeling the strong, lively grip. "If I get the chance, I'll repay you," he said, his eyes glinting as if he wanted to say more, but he just nodded and got into his car. I drove home that night, my mind adrift. The image of the old man lingered in my thoughts. Something about him felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. Maybe it was just exhaustion, I told myself. But a few days later, I saw him again, this time at a small roadside diner where I often grabbed coffee before my morning shift. He was sitting in a corner, holding a cup of black coffee, his eyes lighting up when he saw me walk in. "Brooks," he called, his voice cheerful, like reuniting with an old friend. I froze, unsure why he was here, but I walked over and sat across from him. We started talking. At first, it was just small talk about Tulsa, the roads I drove, the chilly weather setting in. But gradually, I found myself opening up. I talked about my job, the long hauls, the pressure of meeting delivery deadlines. Then, as if someone had unlocked a door in my heart, I started talking about my family, about my parents, the cold dinners, the way they looked at me like I was a failure. I don't know why I poured my heart out to a stranger like that. Maybe it was because he listened, truly listened, with attentive eyes and gentle nods. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just occasionally offered insightful advice, as if he understood me better than I understood myself. "Have you ever thought your family might be hiding something, Brooks?" he asked during one of our meetings, his voice lowering, his gaze piercing through me. I flinched, feeling as though he'd touched a crack in the wall of my mind. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He just smiled and shook his head. "Just a feeling. Every family has secrets, don't they?" My encounters with Lester became a part of my life. He appeared in places I didn't expect. A parking lot where I took my lunch break, a road I frequently drove, even a small diner where I stopped for a sandwich. Each time he struck up a conversation naturally, as if we'd known each other forever. Strangely, he knew details about my family I hadn't shared. He mentioned my father's time in the oil fields, speaking as if he'd witnessed those days. "Alan, he was a hard worker, but ambition can change a man," he said once, his gaze distant. I was stunned. "How do you know my father's name?" I asked, my heart pounding. He just smiled, changed the subject, but his eyes held something profound. I began to feel an invisible thread connecting me to Lester. He wasn't just a stranger I'd met by chance. He was the first person who truly cared about me, who didn't judge or belittle me. In him, I saw a figure I'd never had. Not my cold parents, but a grandfather, a father, a friend. But alongside that warmth grew a gnawing suspicion. Why did he know so much about me? Why did he always show up at the right time in the right place? And why, every time I looked into his eyes, did I see a deep sadness, as if he were holding back a truth too big to speak? Those questions swirled in my mind, but I wasn't ready to seek answers. All I knew was that with Lester, I no longer felt alone. Our brief meetings became rare bright spots in my monotonous life. But what I didn't expect was that a single offhand comment about him at a family dinner would shake the familiar world I knew to its core. It was a Friday evening and Tulsa was bitterly cold, with the wind whistling through the cracks of the suburban house's windows. I had just returned from work, exhausted after a long day driving through fog-laden roads. Dinner, as usual, unfolded in heavy silence. My father, Alan, sat at the head of the table, quietly slicing his beef. My mother, Sharon, busied herself arranging dishes, her forced smile lingering on her lips like a habit. I sat across from them, trying to swallow the mashed potatoes, but my mind was elsewhere. With Lester, his strange words, and those unforgettable, piercing eyes. I don't know what prompted me to speak. Perhaps it was the suffocating silence in the room, or maybe I wanted to test if my parents knew anything about this mysterious old man. "I saw Lester again today," I said, my voice deliberately casual, as if it were just a passing remark. "He used to work in the oil industry, knows a lot about Tulsa. He even knows about you two." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. My father stopped cutting his meat, his knife frozen mid-air. My mother, wiping her hands on her apron, dropped the cloth to the floor. They both turned to look at me, and for a fleeting moment I saw something I'd never seen before. Panic. A flash of fear crossed my father's eyes, quickly masked by his usual scowl. My mother tried to smile, but her lips trembled as if she were struggling to hold back a tidal wave of emotion. "Lester?" my father growled, setting the knife down on the table with a sharp clink of metal against wood. "Who's Lester? Where did you meet him?" His voice wasn't the usual disdain. It was something sharper, almost desperate. "Just an old man," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady despite my quickening pulse. "I met him on the road, then a few times at a diner. He said he worked in the oil fields like you did back then. He's friendly, but he knows a lot about our family. I don't understand how." My mother, still standing, abruptly turned away, pretending to busy herself with clearing plates. "Probably just an old man who likes to tell stories, Brooks," she said, her voice higher than usual, trembling like a taut string. "Don't pay it any mind. Old people often rambles." But I couldn't let it go. Something was off. My father, who always controlled everything in the house, was now gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "Listen, Brooks," he said, his voice dropping to a commanding tone. "You shouldn't be hanging around strangers with unclear backgrounds. Who knows what he wants? You're too trusting." I wanted to argue, to say that Lester wasn't a stranger, that he made me feel more understood than my own parents ever did. But I stayed silent, cowed by the look in my father's eyes that allowed no defiance. My mother quickly chimed in, her voice sweet but hurried. "Come on, eat your food, Brooks. It's getting cold. Your father's just worried about you." She shifted the conversation to the weather, but I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was consumed by their reaction. Why did the mere mention of Lester's name rattle them so much? Why did my father, who prided himself on his toughness, look like he'd just seen a ghost? That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The suspicion that had once been a small crack was now a bottomless chasm. I started noticing details I'd overlooked before. The times my parents whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. The way my mother hurriedly slammed shut the cabinet of papers when I entered the room. And how they dodged every question about the past, especially about my grandfather, a man I only knew through fleeting, vague remarks like smoke slipping through my fingers. A few days later, while washing dishes in the kitchen, I overheard my parents talking in the living room. They thought I wasn't paying attention, but their voices, though hushed, reached my ears. "Lester," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be him, Alan. He's been dead for years. It's just a coincidence, right?" My father didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was so low I had to hold my breath to hear. "If it is him, we're in big trouble. No one can know about that. No one." I stood frozen, still holding a dripping sponge, water pooling on the floor. My heart pounded like it might burst from my chest. Lester, the man I'd come to see as a friend, a confidant, was somehow connected to my parents. And why were they so terrified, as if his name were a curse? I wanted to rush out, to scream and demand the truth, but my feet felt nailed to the floor. Fear, curiosity, and an unnamed pain churned within me. In the days that followed, I avoided mentioning Lester in front of my parents. But in my mind, questions about him smoldered, impossible to extinguish. I had no idea that one day that spark would ignite, shaking every truth I thought I knew. That weekend afternoon, Tulsa was bathed in a fiery red sunset, as if the sky sensed an approaching storm. I had just returned from a short shift, exhausted but relieved to be off early. My mind was still haunted by thoughts of Lester, his piercing eyes, his cryptic words. The familiar road to our suburban house came into view, with its faded white picket fence and the old oak tree standing silently as always. But as I turned in, my heart skipped a beat. A frail figure stood at the gate under the oak's canopy. The fading sunlight illuminated a weathered face and those unmistakable gleaming eyes. It was Lester. He stood there, leaning on a cane, his demeanor calm yet radiating an odd determination, like a soldier preparing for a final battle. I stopped the truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady myself. How did he know where I lived? And why was he here, at this exact moment? A wave of unease surged within me, as if I were standing on the threshold of a secret I wasn't ready to face. I took a deep breath, stepped out of the truck, my legs heavy as lead. "Lester!" I called, my voice faltering, echoing in the quiet afternoon air. "What are you doing here?" He smiled, a warm smile tinged with an indescribable sadness. "I thought it was time to meet your family, Brooks," he said, his voice low and resolute, as if he had planned this moment for years. His words stunned me. Meet my family? What did he mean? My mind swirled with questions I wanted to blurt out, but instead, an inexplicable urge pushed me to open the gate. "Come inside," I said, trying to mask the turmoil in my heart. I led him through the entrance, each step feeling like it was bringing me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to know. As I pushed open the door, the air inside the house was as heavy as ever. The smell of stew wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the crackling of the fireplace. My father, Alan, sat in his old armchair, a newspaper spread across his lap, his eyes scanning the lines. My mother, Sharon, was busy in the kitchen, her hands swiftly wiping down surfaces and preparing dinner. I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence. "Dad, Mom, we have a guest," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. My father looked up, frowning, while my mother stepped out of the kitchen, still holding a white porcelain plate. Then they saw Lester. Time seemed to freeze. The newspaper slipped from my father's hands, hitting the floor with a dry thud. His face turned ashen, as if all the blood had drained from his body. His eyes, usually cold and controlled, widened with raw fear. "Lester," he whispered, his voice stuttering as if the name were a dagger plunging into his heart. My mother fared worse. The plate in her hands fell to the floor, shattering into pieces, the sound of breaking porcelain like an explosion in the silent room. She covered her mouth, her eyes wavering, unable to meet the old man's gaze. "No, it can't be," she muttered, her voice choked as if trying to convince herself this was just a nightmare. I stood between them, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, making it hard to breathe. I looked at my father, then my mother, then back at Lester, searching for an explanation. Anything to make sense of what was happening. But before I could speak, Lester stepped forward, his movements slow but steady, like a man prepared for this moment. His eyes locked onto my father, unwavering. Then in a voice calm yet chilling, he said, "Alan, it's been a while. Sharon, you're looking well. I'm Lester Hatlin, Alan's father, your grandfather, Brooks. And as you can see, I'm very much alive." His words hit like a bolt of lightning. I felt the floor beneath me tremble as if the world were collapsing. My grandfather. Lester was my grandfather. The man my parents said had died long before I was born. My mind went blank, filled only with the sound of my racing heartbeat and a cold shiver running down my spine. I looked at my parents, hoping they'd burst out laughing, that this was some sick joke. But my father stood frozen, his mouth moving as if trying to speak, yet no words came out. My mother clutched her face, tears streaming down her cheeks, her shoulders trembling like leaves in a storm. "No, it can't be," she repeated, her voice frail like a plea. I wanted to scream, to demand why, to know what this was all about. But my throat was tight, as if someone were choking it. I looked at Lester, his expression still calm, but I saw a deep pain in his eyes, as if he'd carried this secret for far too long. "Grandfather," I whispered, my voice breaking, barely believing my own words. Before anyone could say more, the wail of police sirens pierced the tense air from outside the gate. I turned and saw red and blue lights flashing through the window. 2 officers stepped in, their uniforms pristine, their faces stern as stone. "Mr. Alan Hatlin, Mrs. Sharon Hatlin," one officer said, his voice firm and devoid of emotion. "We need you to come with us to the station regarding a matter from years ago. Insurance fraud and suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder." Those words struck like hammer blows to my head. Insurance fraud? Conspiracy to commit murder? I stood frozen, my mind spinning, unable to believe what I'd just heard. Neighbors began gathering outside the gate, their murmurs filtering in like the hum of bees. "What's going on? The Hatlins?" I always knew something was off about them. Their words were like tiny knives piercing my heart, filling me with shame and confusion. My father tried to say something, his voice trembling. "You've got it wrong. This is a misunderstanding." But the officer only shook his head, motioning for him to step toward the car. My mother turned to me, her eyes filled with pain, as if she wanted to say something. But she only lowered her head and let the police lead her away. I stood there, my feet rooted to the ground, watching my parents being taken away like criminals. A mix of pain and shock washed over me, like a wave pulling me under. Lester stood beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch was gentle but firm. "Brooks, I've been waiting for this moment for a long time," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow but resolute. "But you need to know the truth, the whole truth." I looked at him, my mind clouded with fog. The truth? What truth could lead to this? My parents being hauled away by the police, and this man whom I thought was a kind stranger turning out to be my grandfather. I wanted to ask, to scream, but my throat remained tight. The house, already suffocating, now sank into a tense silence, as if every sound had been swallowed by an invisible black hole. The dim yellow light from the ceiling lamp cast shadows on Lester's weathered face. He sat down in the old armchair where my father had been just minutes ago, his eyes calm, but laden with unspoken pain. I stood there, my feet rooted to the floor, my hands gripping the edge of the table as if letting go would send me plummeting into the abyss of a truth I wasn't ready to face. "Sit down, Brooks," Lester said, his voice low and gentle, yet carrying a weight that left me no choice but to obey. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him, my heart pounding, each beat like a hammer striking my chest. Outside, the sunset had faded, leaving only thick darkness enveloping the house. The murmurs of neighbors at the gate drifted in but grew faint, as if the outside world no longer existed. It was just me and Lester, and the story he was about to tell. A story I knew would change everything. "I didn't want you to face this, Brooks," he began, his voice slow, as if carefully choosing each word. "But you deserve to know the truth. The whole truth. About me, about your parents, and about what happened all those years ago." I swallowed hard, trying to hold his gaze, but my hands trembled, forcing me to clasp them tightly to hide my panic. Lester took a deep breath, his eyes drifting as if revisiting memories long buried. "I used to be an oil worker," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Back then in Tulsa, the oil industry was everything. I worked day and night on the rigs, breathing in red dust and the sharp smell of oil, all to provide for my family. But age spares no one. My health declined. I wasn't as quick as I used to be. I knew I couldn't keep working forever, but I pushed on because I wanted Alan to have a better future." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room as if searching for traces of those bygone days. "One day, Alan and Sharon came to me," he continued. "They talked about getting a life insurance policy for me. They said it was a way to prepare for the future, to ensure the family's security if anything happened to me. I was deeply moved, Brooks. I thought my son and daughter-in-law cared about me. I signed those papers without a hint of doubt. I trusted them with all my heart." His voice faltered, and I saw his frail hands clenched together. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to ask, to urge him to continue, but I was terrified of what I'd hear. Lester took another breath, but not long after, I started noticing something was wrong. Alan grew distant. Sharon avoided my eyes. They started talking about a trip, a family trip to the mountains near Tulsa. I thought it was just a way to mend our family, to grow closer. But I was wrong, Brooks. It was the biggest mistake of my life. My throat felt parched, as if someone were squeezing it. "What did they do?" I whispered, my voice so faint I barely recognized it. Lester looked at me, his eyes heavy with grief. "They pushed me off a cliff," he said, his voice eerily calm. "They staged it to look like an accident. But they didn't know I got caught on a branch, injured but alive. Broken bones, my head spinning. I thought I was dead. But a forester found me, took me to his cabin and cared for me. I lost my memory, didn't know who I was or what had happened. Only later did I learn. Your parents claimed the insurance money, declared me dead, held a sham funeral to fool everyone, and went on living as if I'd never existed." I sat frozen, my mind engulfed by a raging wave. My parents tried to kill my grandfather. They deceived everyone, including me. I remembered the times my mother spoke of my grandfather, her voice always curt and cold. "He's been gone a long time, don't ask." I remembered my father's eyes, how he dodged whenever I brought up the past. Lester continued, a sad smile flickering on his lips. "I know they never spoke of me. They wanted to bury me, not just in that cliff, but in everyone's memories. But you, Brooks, you're the reason I came back." I frowned, confused. "Why me? And why wait until now to show up?" I asked, my heart racing. Lester leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "I lost my memory after the fall, living for years in a haze of fragmented memories with the forester who saved me," He cared for me like family. Then one day I was in a car accident. A minor collision, but strangely it jolted my memory back. I remembered everything. Alan, Sharon, the accident on the mountain, all of it. I started investigating, gathering evidence. Insurance documents, my old journals, testimonies from people who knew the truth. And then I discovered something that wouldn't let me stay silent. He paused, his expression graver than ever. They're repeating the same scheme. With you. Just like they did with me. I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. With me? I echoed, my voice barely audible. What do you mean? They've taken out multiple life insurance policies in your name, Lester said, his voice dropping, each word like a heavy stone. I don't know what they're planning, but I couldn't let history repeat itself. I came back for you, Brooks. To protect you. I sat motionless, my mind blank. The truth pierced my heart like a knife. My parents, the people who raised me, who I thought, despite their coldness, were still my family, had betrayed my grandfather. And now they were plotting against my life? A wave of pain and anger surged within me, but at the same time I felt like a lost child, unsure what to believe anymore. I looked at Lester, the grandfather I never knew existed, and saw in his eyes not just determination but love. A love I'd never received from my parents. A few days later, I received word from the police. Alan and Sharon Hatlin had been formally detained, awaiting trial. The cold, clinical words in the notice, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, echoed in my mind like hammer blows, each one shattering a piece of my memories of my parents. I didn't know what I felt. Anger, pain, or just an endless void. Lester stayed by my side, quiet, not pushing me to do anything. "Do you want to see them, Brooks?" he asked, his voice low but gentle. I didn't answer right away, but deep down I knew I needed one final confrontation. Not to forgive, but to understand, or at least to put an end to the years spent in the shadow of lies. That morning, the Tulsa sky was overcast, heavy clouds hanging low as if pressing down on the city. Lester and I drove to the detention center, a cold concrete building on the outskirts, surrounded by barbed wire fences. In the car, I said nothing, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to suppress the tidal wave of emotion surging within me. Lester sat beside me, leaning on his cane, his gaze fixed somewhere distant as if preparing for a battle whose outcome he already knew. "You don't have to forgive them, Brooks," he said evenly. "But you need to face the truth, so you can move forward." The visitation room was small and frigid, with gray walls and a thick glass partition separating us from my parents. I sat on a hard plastic chair facing them, but they were no longer the people I once knew. My father, Alan, sat rigid, his face gaunt, his eyes flashing with a spark of hatred when he saw Lester standing beside me. My mother, Sharon, looked haggard, her usually neat hair disheveled, her eyes red as if she'd been crying. When her gaze met mine, I saw a flicker of pleading, but it was quickly overshadowed by panic as she noticed Lester. The air in the room was thick, as if no one dared breathe too loudly. I wanted to say something, but my throat tightened, as if all my questions and accusations were trapped in my chest. My father broke the silence first, his voice booming through the glass. "What are you doing here, Brooks? And this old man?" He pointed at Lester, his face flushed with anger. "He's a liar, a lunatic trying to destroy our family. And you, Brooks, you're a traitor of a son siding with him." His words stabbed my heart like a knife. A traitor? Me, the traitor? I looked at him, the father I'd once feared, whose approval I'd craved, and felt a surge of anger, but also a wrenching pain. "A traitor?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Dad, Mom, what have you done? You tried to kill my grandfather, and now, me too." My mother burst into tears, her trembling hands touching the glass as if reaching for me. "Brooks, it's not like that," she cried, her voice choked, tears streaming down her face. "We were only trying to protect the family. You have to believe me, sweetheart." But her voice faltered, and I saw her avoid Lester's gaze as if his presence was an undeniable accusation. Lester, still standing beside me, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but each word cut like a blade. "Protect the family, Sharon? You pushed me off a cliff, staged a fake funeral, and collected the insurance money as if I never existed. You call that protection?" He stepped closer to the glass, his eyes locked on my father. "And now, you were planning to do the same to your own son." "I've gathered enough evidence, Alan. Insurance documents, my journals, testimonies from those who know the truth. I've been working with a lawyer, and the truth will come out. You can't run from it forever." My father slammed his fist on the table, his face contorted with rage and fear. "You're lying," he roared, his voice nearly breaking. "You're trying to ruin us. Brooks, don't believe him. We're your family." But in his eyes I saw no sincerity, only the desperation of a man backed into a corner. My mother was different. She didn't shout, just sat there, tears streaming down her face, muttering, "Please, Brooks, please, don't abandon me. We only wanted what's best for you." But her words no longer reached me. I looked at her, the woman who once held me as a child, who told me bedtime stories, and felt my heart shatter. But alongside the pain was a cold clarity. They were no longer my family, not after what they'd done. I stood, my legs trembling but resolute. I looked at my parents one last time, my gaze empty, as if every emotion had been drained from me. "I used to think you were everything to me," I said, my voice low but clear. But I was wrong. I turned away, not looking back, and walked out of the room with Lester beside me. My mother's sobs, my father's shouts, they faded behind the closing door. Outside, the rain began to fall, cold droplets seeping into my jacket. Lester placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Brooks," he said. I didn't respond, just stood there, letting the rain wash away the tears I didn't want anyone to see. The rain seemed to cleanse not only the dust from Tulsa's roads, but also the last fragments of the family I once believed in. My parents, the people I once called family, were now just faint shadows, locked behind bars and their lies. But beside me stood Lester, my grandfather, whose existence I hadn't known, steady like an old oak, carrying the story of years forgotten. In the days that followed, as we awaited my parents' trial, I felt like a boat adrift on a vast ocean with no shore or direction. Each night I lay on my creaky bed in the now empty house, listening to the rain tap against the window, my mind swirling with unanswered questions. Why did my parents do it? What turned them into people willing to betray their own flesh and blood? And me? How was I supposed to go on when everything I'd believed in had crumbled? One early morning, with Tulsa still shrouded in thick fog, Lester knocked on my bedroom door. "Come with me, Brooks," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "There's a place I want you to see." I hesitated, but his eyes, both kind and resolute, left me no room to refuse. We got into the truck and drove along winding red dirt roads leading out of Tulsa toward a sparse forest nestled at the foot of low mountains. At the end of a narrow trail, a small wooden cabin appeared, so simple it nearly blended into the surrounding trees. Its roof was covered in green moss, its weathered wooden walls faded by sun and rain, and a crooked fence encircled a tiny garden. Was this where Lester had lived, in the years when the world, including his family, believed he was dead? Stepping inside, I felt the stark simplicity of the place. A worn wooden table, a few chipped chairs, a small fireplace blackened with soot. Faded photographs hung on the walls, an old tattered jacket draped over a hook, and a simple bed covered with a threadbare wool blanket. Everything in this cabin told a story of survival, of a man forgotten by the world yet determined to endure. "This is where I recovered and survived," Lester said, his voice lowering as if drawing me into painful memories. "The forester who saved me, his name was Amos. He didn't just save my life. He gave me a home, a reason to keep going." We sat at the wooden table and Lester began to speak. His voice was slow, each word like a chisel carving into the air. After the fall from the cliff, I didn't know who I was. My mind was a blank slate with only shattered fragments of memory. Images of Alan as a child, the sound of my wife's laughter, Alan's mother. But I didn't know if they were real or just illusions. Amos cared for me, bandaged my wounds, taught me how to survive in the wilderness. But the loneliness, that was the hardest part. I knew I'd lost something vital, but I couldn't remember what. And then when my memory returned, I realized that my own son, the person I loved most, had betrayed me. I sat silently, a sharp pain piercing my chest. I tried to imagine Lester, a man who'd once been strong, the backbone of his family, lying unconscious at the base of a cliff, amnesiac, living in solitude deep in the forest. "How did you keep going?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "How did you not give up?" Lester smiled, a sad but powerful smile. "Because I believed that even if the world turned its back on me, there was still something worth living for." Amos taught me that, and when my memory returned, I knew I had to come back, not for revenge, but to protect you, Brooks. You were the reason I didn't give up. He stood and led me to a corner of the cabin where an old wooden chest sat securely locked. He opened it and pulled out a tattered leather-bound notebook. "This is my journal," he said, flipping through its yellowed pages. "I wrote down everything I could remember, every tiny fragment of memory. And this," he pointed to a faded photograph of a skinny, blonde-haired boy sitting on the shoulders of a young man. "This is Alan, your father, when he was young. Back then he was frail, often sick, but so well behaved. His mother and I doted on him endlessly. I thought he'd grow up to be a good man." His voice caught, and I saw his eyes glisten as if he were holding back a wave of emotion. I stared at the photo, searching for traces of the father I knew, the cold, bitter man willing to murder his own father. But in the picture there was only an innocent boy, his smile radiant, his eyes bright with trust. "How?" I whispered, my voice choking. "How did he become like this?" Lester shook his head. "Greed. Greed can turn a good person into a monster. Alan is no longer the boy in that photo. He chose his own path, and that path led to darkness." My throat tightened, hot tears welling up, but I fought them back. I thought of the years living under my parents' roof, their criticisms, their cold stares, and the secrets they kept hidden. Then I looked at Lester, a man who'd survived the abyss not just physically, but spiritually. In him I saw a strength I'd never known, the strength of forgiveness, patience, and unconditional love. The bond between us, which had begun to form during our earlier meetings, now grew stronger than ever. I was no longer a lost boy, but a grandson, guided by a grandfather who had triumphed over darkness. As we left the cabin, the rain had stopped, and faint sunlight began to break through the trees. I looked at Lester, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace, though my heart remained heavy. "Thank you," I said, my voice soft but sincere. He only smiled, patted my shoulder gently, and we walked away, leaving the cabin, the witness to years forgotten, behind us. Weeks passed since the day my parents were arrested. During that time, I lived like a shadow, going to work and returning home. But my mind was in constant turmoil. Each night I lay in bed trying to recall distant memories of my parents, the rare dinners when my mother smiled genuinely, or the time my father taught me to drive when I was 16. But those images were now overshadowed by a horrific truth. They had tried to kill my grandfather, and perhaps me as well. Lester was the only one keeping me grounded with the stories he shared, the simple meals we ate together, and his eyes, both steadfast and gentle like a lighthouse in a storm. The day of the trial arrived, and Tulsa was cloaked in a cold gray sky, as if the entire city were holding its breath. The courthouse was an old building, its gray stone walls and long corridors echoing with footsteps. I sat in the public gallery, my hands clasped tightly, trying to suppress the trembling. Lester sat beside me, his posture straight, his weathered face calm yet resolute, like a soldier preparing for a final battle. Before us stood my parents, Alan and Sharon Hatlin, behind the defendant's dock, their faces gaunt, their eyes flickering between fear and resentment. Seeing them, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, but I no longer cried. My tears had dried up long ago. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a sharp voice, stepped forward to present the case. Alan Hatlin and Sharon Hatlin are charged with conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and financial deception, he declared, his voice resounding through the courtroom. He laid out a chilling, irrefutable chain of evidence: the life insurance policy in Lester Hatlin's name, the payout records my parents had claimed, bank statements showing they'd spent the money on real estate investments and lavish vacations. And finally, Lester's testimony, the victim, the man they thought was long dead. My parents' defense attorney, a woman with keen eyes, tried to counter. It was all an accident, she argued, her voice persuasive. There's no direct evidence that Mr. and Mrs. Hatlin intentionally pushed Lester Hatlin off the cliff. He went missing, and they believed he was dead, claiming the insurance was a lawful act under those circumstances. She glanced at my parents, seeking their support, but my father only bowed his head, while my mother covered her face, her shoulders trembling. Then it was Lester's turn. As he took the witness stand, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. He stood tall, leaning on his cane, his gaze fixed on my parents without a hint of wavering. When he spoke, his voice was calm but cutting, like a blade slicing through the air. "I am Lester Hatlin," he began, "father of Alan Hatlin, grandfather of Brooks Hatlin. Years ago, I was pushed off a cliff by my own son and daughter-in-law. They staged it as an accident, leaving me near death, amnesiac, and living in seclusion in the wilderness. They held a fake funeral, claimed the insurance money, and went on living as if I had never existed." I sat frozen, my heart tightening. Lester continued, his voice steady, though I saw his hand grip his cane tightly. "I survived thanks to a forester named Amos. He cared for me, helped me recover even though I didn't know who I was. Years later, a car accident jolted my memory awake. I came back, not for revenge, but to protect my grandson Brooks from the same scheme Alan and Sharon were plotting against him." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I looked at my parents, waiting for their reaction. My father leapt to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "He's lying," he shouted, pointing at Lester. "It's all lies. We didn't do anything. He disappeared and we thought he was dead." But his voice faltered, and I saw his eyes waver, as if he knew his words couldn't convince anyone. My mother was different. She sat there, tears streaming down her face, her trembling hands clutching her cheeks. "Brooks, I didn't do anything wrong," she muttered, her voice choked. But the more she spoke, the more her contradictions surfaced. "We just wanted to protect the family, We didn't mean to hurt anyone." But when the prosecutor presented the life insurance policies in my name, policies my parents had taken out without my knowledge, she crumpled, left with no defense. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted decisively toward Lester and the prosecutor. The evidence was too clear, Lester's testimony too sharp, and my parents' denials sounded like the desperate cries of a trapped animal. When the judge struck the gavel declaring Alan and Sharon Hatlin guilty, pending their final sentencing, I felt a cold void spread through my chest. They had lost everything, not just their freedom, but their humanity and the family they claimed to protect. I left the courthouse, stepping into the gray, overcast sky, feeling as though a part of me had been left behind in that room. Lester walked beside me, silent, but his presence was enough to keep me from feeling alone. A light drizzle fell, cold droplets soaking into my jacket, but I no longer felt the chill. In my heart was a vast emptiness, where the image of my parents, once my entire world, now lay in shattered fragments. I didn't know where to go, what to do, or how to keep living. But Lester, with his steadfast gaze and gentle pat on the shoulder, had become my sole anchor in the storm. "Come live with me, Brooks. The cabin may not be big, but it's enough for both of us," he said, his voice low but warm. I nodded, not asking further questions because I knew I had nowhere else to go. The suburban house where I grew up was now just an empty shell, filled with painful memories and lies. 2 months later, the news came. Alan and Sharon Hatlin were sentenced for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and financial deception. My father received a 42-year prison sentence, while my mother, as an accomplice, was sentenced to 32 years. The notification arrived in a brief, cold letter from the court. I read it, then folded it away, feeling neither tears nor anger, just an emptiness, as if a large piece of my heart had been carved out. I returned to the suburban house one last time to gather my things, but stepping inside, I barely recognized it. The faded red brick walls, the curtains my mother had carefully chosen, the armchair where my father used to sit, all felt cold and desolate, like a haunted house abandoned to time. I stood in the living room, listening to the wind whistle through the windows, feeling like a stranger in the home where I'd grown up. I grabbed a few clothes, some books, and left without looking back. My new life began at Lester's wooden cabin. It was simple, almost austere, yet it carried a warmth I'd never felt in the suburban house. Each morning I woke to dawn's light slipping through the gaps in the wooden walls, hearing birdsong and the quiet crackle of Lester starting a fire in the hearth. Together we tended the small garden behind the cabin, lush rows of vegetables, a few stunted but fruitful apple trees. I learned to prune branches, water plants, and patch leaks in the roof. These simple tasks made me feel alive, truly alive, not just existing as I had before. One afternoon, as golden sunlight stretched across the fields, Lester led me to a cliff not far from the cabin. He stopped, leaning on his cane, and gazed down into the deep ravine below. "This is where they pushed me," he said, his voice steady but heavy. I stood beside him, feeling as if someone were squeezing my heart. That ravine was where my grandfather nearly lost his life. I tried to imagine him lying there, bloodied, unconscious, betrayed by his own son. "Why don't you hate them?" I asked, my voice choking. "After everything they did?" Lester turned to me, his eyes profound as if seeing through me. "Hate only weighs you down," he said. "I chose to live, to find you, because that's how I win. Life is worth more than any revenge." Over time, Lester taught me lessons my parents never did. He spoke of honesty, of cherishing every breath, every day of life. "Don't let greed or fear guide you, Brooks," he said one evening as we sat by the fire, eating the simple potato soup he'd made. "Live so that when you look back, you have no regrets." Those words etched themselves into my mind, like a light illuminating the path ahead. I still went to work each morning, driving my truck along Tulsa's roads, but I no longer felt alone. In the evenings, I returned to the cabin where Lester and I shared dinner, talking about small things, from tending apple trees to stories of Tulsa in his youth. Those meals, though simple, were filled with a sense of family I'd never known in the suburban house. Lester was not just my grandfather, he was my friend, my teacher, and my true family. The bond between us grew stronger with each passing day. Every time I looked at him, I saw a man who had survived the abyss, not just physically, but spiritually. And in me, the pain began to subside like waves calming after a storm. Years after the trial, Lester passed away peacefully in the same wooden cabin where he had once lived in seclusion. I found him one early morning lying on his simple bed, his face serene as if he were ready for his final journey. In his hand was the tattered leather-bound notebook where he had recorded fragments of his memories and life's lessons. I sat beside him, holding his frail hand that had once comforted me through the darkest days, and I wept. Not out of loss, but because I knew he had lived a full life, despite all the pain and betrayal. He left behind his entire estate, the cabin, passed down to him by the forester Amos before his own passing, a small stake in a local oil company, and most importantly, a spiritual legacy that no amount of money could rival. I, Brooks Hatlin, was no longer the lost boy of those earlier days. From a young truck driver living under the cold shadow of my parents, I had grown into a man with clear purpose and conviction. The cabin, though simple, had become my true home. I continued tending the garden Lester and I had cultivated together, repairing the wooden walls and living a modest but meaningful life. Each morning, as dawn's light slipped through the gaps in the cabin's walls, I felt I was carrying on his journey. a journey of survival, honesty, and love. Sitting by the fireplace, leafing through Lester's notebook, I realized the greatest inheritance he left me wasn't the cabin or the company shares. It was the lessons he had etched into my heart. "The truth can never stay buried forever," he had written. And I understood that despite my parents' attempts to conceal their crimes, the truth had found its way back, like a river that never stops flowing. "Greed can destroy an entire family," he cautioned, and I saw that clearly in my parents' fate, people who traded family honor and freedom for money. But the most important lesson, the one he often repeated by the fire, was, "True family is built on trust and love, not money." To me, Lester embodied that family. A grandfather who returned from the darkness to give me a true sense of belonging. One afternoon, I returned to the cliff where Lester had nearly lost his life. The wind blew, carrying the scent of red earth and dry grass, a reminder of the years he fought to survive. I stood there, gazing down into the deep ravine where jagged rocks lay still, silent witnesses to a crime now exposed. I thought of my parents, of what they had done and the path they had chosen. Then I thought of Lester, the man who overcame it all, not just to live, but to protect me. I whispered to myself like a vow, "I'll live differently, Grandpa. A life of integrity, gratitude, and the honor you left behind." I turned away from the cliff, feeling the faint sunlight on my shoulders. Tulsa stretched out before me, its familiar roads, ones I had driven thousands of times. But now, they were no longer paths of escape. They were roads leading to a new future. A future where I carried Lester's legacy not just in my heart, but in every step I took. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew I wouldn't walk alone. His words, about truth, honesty, and love, would forever be the light guiding my way.